Hi, this is Greg Kilstrom. Welcome to Season 3 of The Agile World, where we discuss customer and employee experience, organizational and workforce transformation, and how business can adapt and continually improve in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed in this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles, or get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. I'm excited to introduce part 2 of a special 3-part series about how reimagining the digital workplace presents a unique opportunity for organizations to transform the employee experience. This series is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Regional Sales Director at TEKsystems, Natalie Lister, and Workplace Services Solution Architect, Paul Valenzuela. Natalie, first, why don't you tell me a little bit about your background and what you do at TEKsystems?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Greg. So I am, as you said, a regional sales director at TEKsystems. I'm responsible for guiding our sales team within 2 of our product lines, one being digital workplace services and the other technology operations management. Been with TEKsystems for just over 8 years now, and really excited to talk a little bit more with you today about some of the transformation that we're seeing in the industry.
Wonderful. And what about you, Paul?
Yeah, so thanks again for having me. Solution architect encompasses probably 3 key areas of the entire life cycle. One is the pre-sale side, which is primarily consulting our customers into a change that is about to take place, and then actually making that change. So we call that transition support or implementation. And then once you get to the other side, is steady state or sustainment, so call that post-sales consulting. So I've been with TEKsystems about 10 years. However, I've been within workplace services solution consulting for the better part of 25 years.
Great. Looking forward to talking with both of you. So during the last 18 months or so, hybrid work has evolved from being a reactive stopgap measure to a fully embedded model for managing the future of work. A recent statistic from IDC estimates that 2/3 of organizations expect to have some type of permanent hybrid work model in 2022. The question many enterprises ask is, how do you sustain hybrid work models over time, especially as many consider the prospect of connecting employees who are in the office with those who are not? How are your customers approaching hybrid or remote work?
First and foremost, our customers are working to get really clear on what hybrid in particular means to them. Traditionally, hybrid work would be any work that is 1 day or more out of the office, with the remainder number of days being remote. And so again, for each customer, the true meaning of hybrid is going to be unique or different to their business, their employee base, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, remote work, 100% remote. So I think getting the clarity for themselves between what that model means and looks like in the long term has been step number 1 for most of our customers. And then the second half of that question, how do we ensure that employees are connecting in the right ways with the right partners, whether they're in the office or not? That's where the structure comes in. And that's been a really critical piece of strategy for our clients. What collaboration activities are best suited to the office versus what ones can be done just as effectively or efficiently remotely. How do we connect employees? Again, those that are remote versus those that are within the 4 walls of the office, and how does technology enable that process? And that's really the work that a lot of our customers are in right now, is defining that for themselves.
Having done what I do for the better part of 25 years, previous to TEKsystems, I was with a top tier IT services company, a company that kind of started outsourcing, if you will. And I've been remote for 22 years. At the early part of that 22 years, and I lived very close to the corporate office, is on Tuesdays and Thursdays is I would end up in the office for no other reason other than just engagement with the team, engagement with the leadership, engagement with the customer. I don't know that we called it hybrid back then, but what I do know is the tools, technology, and processes were not as significant as they are today, right? So the advent of better tools, better technology, it's almost like just it just happens. Now, one thing to be sure is we've got some solution architects that are part of my team that are strategically placed next to the solution centers, but I can see even that starting to change as we kind of evolve with our customers, because what we're finding is, for example, Teams, WebEx, as long as we're video and as long as we, have all the tools and processes, at our fingertips, I don't know that it's necessary to be within close proximity to a facility, because obviously um, the customers are going through the same thing, that if we're delivering a solution from their prem, is that we're not able to go on their prem either currently, right? So, as Natalie stated, some of those processes and technology are still being figured out. And then, as some of those jurisdictional changes are taking place with COVID and social distancing requirements, um, they're starting a plan and then they're backing out of that plan. So it's almost like they're playing Cotton Eye Joe, take two steps forward, one step back, and still really trying to define that.
Yeah. As you're talking with customers, what are some of the big challenges around hybrid work they're dealing with, particularly when it comes to collaboration, when some employees are in an office and others are remote?
I want to go back to what Natalie said. What is hybrid? Whether it's 2 days a week, whether it's one day a week, truly defining what it means to the customer, and then determining what skills or knowledge workers really need to be within the close proximity or even um, on a prem or in a facility. And I think that's the $1 million question that's being asked right now is, if I could say this, who's who in the zoo, right? Is who really needs to be there and for what reasons? And then HR comes in and says, well, is there a particular reason why you chose that persona? Because those employees will be asking, why does Johnny and Jane get to be off, remote 100%, and why do we not get to, right? So that's the $1 million question right now. And as customers are starting to create more flexibility in that hybrid workforce, there is a cause and effect. If we choose this knowledge worker to be hybrid, but not this other one, what's the possible impact? Because other companies might be offering that flexibility, and we could potentially lose good, solid performers.
The increased demand for PCs and tablets as a result of this new model of working. Gartner predicted earlier this year that shipments would exceed 500 million units for the first time in history. So couple that with the supply chain issues that we're seeing, and that's made that whole process logistically more complex than ever. Um, and then how do you not just get the right equipment to your employees, but how does that now impact your evergreen, your refresh, your technology support strategies? So again, really challenging logistical equations for our customers to figure out. And layer in on top of that our talent pool has expanded by nature of customers and companies being more open to remote workers. In some cases, as Paul mentioned, it's not physically possible for an employee to join their team in the office. Maybe they are across the country. And so that's where technology again comes into play, collaboration tools and platforms, customers setting up Zoom rooms, platforms like Microsoft Teams, of course. So how do we then again implement technology that enables that point of connection when it's not physically possible for teams to be together, or as Paul says, it just doesn't make sense by proxy of the role that they play?
When at least part of your workforce is remote, what do you think the role of the physical office will become, or maybe how is it already being used by organizations in potentially different ways?
Sure. I think to make a very general statement, the role of the physical office for most companies will become that of a true collaboration space, um, or an environment for those employees that aren't able to set up the right home office environment, or quite simply need a break from the home office environment every now and then. So I think it's going to be a much more transient space than it was historically. But pre-pandemic, a lot of our customers were already exploring hotel-style desk spaces, collaboration rooms that were reservable, and piloting different technologies like tech lockers for employees to be able to come into the collaboration space, grab the tech that they needed to make the meeting happen, and then leave it for the next team member. So again, I think it's going to be very much focused on collaboration versus historically very dedicated spaces.
Well, hate to keep going back, but 20 years ago, again, I was part of an organization, global organization, IT services. This company out of Palo Alto, California, you might know of it. I won't mention the name, but we had the Southwest corporate facility in Dallas, Texas, and we had four very large office settings. Probably upwards of about 7,000 employees would frequent that particular campus on any given day. And as remote became an option, and then hybrid became more of an option, is over an 18-month period, that 7,000 employee community went from four big, large facilities and a data center down to one office and not even a data center. And so just in 18 months alone, right? So now let's pivot 20 years later, is prior to COVID impacting, the world, we had three primary solution centers within TEKsystems that were occupied by our service desk analyst and some leadership. So you had Dallas, you had Baltimore, and you had Manila, Philippines. When COVID hit, um, approximately 1,000 service desk analysts started working from home. Now, 18 to 24 months later, those, call it 750 of that 1,000, are still working from home. And so now the question becomes, from a business perspective, is okay, so what do we do as COVID and social distancing is no longer a thing? Is what do we do if we know we're not going to ever go back to full brick and mortar facilities, three of them, of the seven we have across the globe? What do we do with the unoccupied space? Do we start to lease it out? Do we sell it back? Certainly, we can't keep it. So now it becomes a business decision, right? And so there's obviously a conundrum that's about to take place. You got the human element, and then you got the business element. I think the customers are really looking for us as the provider to figure all that out, in and amongst all the other challenges that they might be having as they're considering a change from maybe insourcing to outsourcing. That is now our issue to help resolve.
Well, and let's talk about that human element too. So, pre pandemic, a huge concern at many orgs was employee productivity. Now, 18 months later, companies are rethinking this whole concept of productivity and what it means. Are organizations still struggling with productivity in a hybrid work environment, or have they kind of figured that out? Where do things stand there?
Yeah, so certainly, centralized service desk, call centers is not new. Um, and so how we measured, call it attendance, is by way of, call it in an intelligent tool or platform, the automated call distribution system. I log in when I'm ready to work, and I log out when I'm not ready to work. And because these platforms are cloud based, the concept of how I measure attendance is the same. That doesn't change.
Right.
However, as the day progresses, am I in adherence or am I out of adherence? Right. And again, we can measure that from wherever we are, and wherever it is that we're delivering. So that in itself hasn't changed, and I don't believe it will change. But what has changed is the cadence or tempo or deliberance of the team leaders or Q managers measuring adherence, measuring attendance or non-attendance, right? Before it may have been beginning of the shift and the end of the shift. Now it's, I need to measure it every hour, every 2 hours. Because obviously, if I'm at home and I might have small children or a family that is close by, perhaps even in the next room, is I'm going to be distracted. So do I go out of adherence? So again, using the tools, but being a little bit more deliberate and almost, if I could use the term cliche, is don't expect what you don't inspect. We have all the tools, we have all the processes, but we need to be more deliberate now than ever.
I think to add on to what Paul has shared already, we've had clarity for a long time in the workplace services space when we think about teams like service desk teams, technology support teams, and we've gotten pretty good at measuring KPIs that not only solve the problem, but also drive the right behaviors. And what we're seeing now is an extension of that mentality to the bigger picture. Customers now are really just starting to come up for air and think about, okay, how should we be measuring productivity, right? What does that look like per job function? What does success look like for this role if that hasn't been clearly defined before, versus measuring keystrokes or hours connected to the company server? There are unique cases. How do you measure and account for differences between someone who's working from home and totally dedicated for 8 hours a day versus someone with a lengthy commute, or someone who is required to drive around the city to meet different customers over the course of the day? So there is a lot of discussion, and it is absolutely a focal point of strategy building for the years to come. How do you define that for the broader community, the broader organization?
And so, in this hybrid and sometimes fully remote workforce, how do you measure if your people are doing a good job or not? Can or should technology play a role in that?
Yeah, I think technology can and should, but it needs to be thoughtful. You need to be employing technology, one, that for the most part, your employees are clear on what they're being measured by, right? As Paul said, who's who in the zoo, and what are they responsible for doing. It's a sensitive topic and a sensitive area, and I think most of the customers that I've spoken to on this topic are really just in the discovery phase, because there's a sense of privacy and confidentiality that needs to be addressed. But there are also benefits, of course, of employing, for lack of a better term, monitoring type technology. So you've got to strike a balance that achieves, what you're after, which is measurement of productivity, while at the same time not having your employees feel like they're under surveillance.
Yeah, earlier Natalie mentioned a key acronym, right? KPI, key performance indicators, not necessarily service level agreements or service level objectives, right? Is how many tickets am I opening and closing? How fast am I answering the phone? What is my customer satisfaction? These are all good metrics, but what wasn't measured as often as it is now and really means something is the employee satisfaction index, right? Now, what we're hearing and being a little bit more deliberate is a team leader, supervisor, delivery manager saying to their team, "Hey, Johnny, Jane, how are you doing? How are you coping with this? Is there anything I can do?" And that's not a tool and that's not a technology, but maybe as you're asking these questions, is there is a technology play there. I don't think have figured that out, right? Now, recently, the organization took a survey, and we did use a tool and technology. We gathered all the analytics, and we very precisely, establish all the metrics, and we made them all nice and pretty. And now we're starting to share and socialize the outcomes of that. Now, what's the plan around that? And how can we get our people to help influence a better outcome of that? Because at the end of the day, although we are a technology services company, our people are our product. And if we're not listening to them, if we're not somewhat addressing their concerns, productivity will fail. Customers will go to someone else. The service will be less than maybe what it could be if we're not listening and reacting or acting upon those challenges that our employees are in fact seeing.
So when it comes to how people switch between solo work where, it's heads down, I know what I need to do, I know what project I'm working on versus more collaborative work where, I would need to be interacting with a lot of different people to even decide what's going to be prioritized, what comes next. How should organizations address these different modes of work in this hybrid remote work model? Do they just let things happen organically, or does there need to be a more formal structure around how to work in these environments?
I think it was said earlier on, as senior leaders, organizations, HR are starting to contemplate, what are the personas, what are the knowledge workers that could and should work remotely or in a hybrid, is now getting down to the individual. Is that individual equipped with good time management, good organization management, and can work without having, say, day-to-day engagement with your leader? Again, I go back to, I've been doing this for 20, 25 years, and I manage my time, and I know exactly what is more urgent than say another particular item on my to-do list. But not all people are called wired that way, nor is their, call it, functional workflow designed that way, right? So I think it's really on a case by case basis. And then as we start to figure that out, again, how do tools, technology, process, and even the human element play a role in that? And it's not an easy answer, and there is no silver bullet. I guarantee you that. But one thing that is for certain, as we're on team meetings, for example, we meet with the architect team once a week. We meet with the senior delivery management team once a week. And what we have established is some rules of engagement. Is when you come onto the team phone or conference call, you're actually showing yourself on the video so that we know that you are present, not just a voice out there waiting to be asked a question, but that you're there, you're present, you're visible, um, things of that nature.
I think Paul summarized it really well. Structure has to come in the form of just clear expectations around things like, hey, when we're on a group call, collaboration call, everyone's cameras are on and everyone's engaged. I also think technology and consistency in technology plays a huge part. A lot of customers have multiple platforms or tools that their employees have access to or historically have had access to. And they're looking at now, how do we streamline that? How do we call our shot on what is our tool of choice to ensure that everyone is communicating in the same forum versus historically some very fractional ability to collaborate because people had access to too many different choices as to how to actually do that and connect with their team members.
Can you walk me through some examples of ways that TEKsystems has helped companies navigate remote work or improved productivity for your customers?
Yeah, a lot of our customer conversations have been centered on automation. So, how can automation technologies and tools be leveraged to better support the remote or hybrid workers? Whether it is giving them the ability to access self-service versus tapping into a tech support team, whether it is automating what was low-level support work historically. What are the ways that, again, technology can enable a more efficient and productive work environment? And then tech's also been extremely involved with a lot of customers' return to office strategies. So, providing the thought leadership and, in lots of cases, the actual physical teams to facilitate the technical support that's required to get employees set up in the quote unquote new office environment if they're a hybrid worker or if they're going back to the office full time. And again, in other cases, a big part of that return to office strategy has been, okay, how do we go forward with a plan that just as seamlessly supports those remote workers as well?
The only thing I would add to what Natalie just said, what I commonly see or hear coming to the table at the beginning of a project, initiative, engagement is data security. Data security has always been a very important element of information services, if you will, right? But now what we're seeing is that they've got a seat at the table and they're being very deliberate. Before, you might protect some of your data, your information behind four walls, calling that a data center, calling it a solution center. Maybe you're doing some of this work on prem. Now that we're remote and we're going through tunneling through, say, a virtual private network, is can we protect the customer's information just as well? And what we're seeing and hearing is our CISOs, our data security analysts, is really saying, I think we can. Tools, technology, and process have really evolved to the point where we don't have to be as adverse as we maybe once were. So, again, everything Natalie said, but again, I think the data security element is making sure that we don't just check that box, but making sure that we're assured and comfortable that the way in which we will do remote work or hybrid work isn't constraining us from moving the dial from an anywhere, any device, any user type of world.
Well, thank you both so much for joining the show. For those listening, what's the best way to keep up with what you and TEKsystems are doing in this space?
Just head to TEKsystems.com. It has everything that you need in one central place.
Wonderful. Again, I'd like to thank Natalie Lister and Paul Valenzuela from TEKsystems for joining the show. Learn more about TEKsystems and their perspective at TEKsystems.com. I'm Greg Kilstrom. Thanks for listening to The Agile World. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by TEKsystems. I'm your host, Greg Kilstrom. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, from my website at theagile.world.